When the guns finally fell silent, the world seemed to hold its breath. The air, once torn by thunder and smoke, settled into a stillness so deep it felt almost fragile. Roads that had carried soldiers and grief now carried only the soft crunch of boots belonging to those who survived. Ruined villages stood like tired sentinels, their broken windows catching the pale light of morning. Fields that had been carved by trenches began to soften under new rain, restoring a faint green that hinted at life returning. People stepped out slowly, as if afraid the quiet might shatter, listening to birdsong that had forgotten fear. In this hush, the echoes of loss remained, but they no longer roared. They lingered like distant memories, trying to find their place in a world reshaping itself. Amid this calm, questions floated in the silence. What comes after so much ruin? How does a land so bruised learn to build again? The wind carried no answers, only the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke, gentle reminders that even in the shadow of devastation, the world continues. And in that continuation, something new, something unexpected, was beginning to root out, waving quietly just beyond sight. Scattered across the quiet villages were children who had lost more than anyone could measure. They wandered in makeshift orphanages, old schoolhouses, abandoned barns, rooms once filled with family laughter. These children tried to build routines out of the fragments left behind. Caretakers did what they could, offering bread, a smile, a reassuring voice, yet resources were always thin. Nights were the hardest. When darkness settled and the walls creaked with the cooling air, the children listened to the quiet and tried to remember faces already fading. They learned to comfort each other, trading stories, sharing crumbs, forming small circles of safety in a world that had taken so much. Still, even in their sorrow, there was a resilience that softened the bleakness. They played when they could, chasing moments of light through courtyards and broken gateways. And though the landscape around them remained heavy with loss, their presence added a fragile, hopeful pulse to a world trying to heal. Their quiet perseverance hinted at futures still waiting to unfold.
The French soldiers guided the prisoners toward the temporary camp on the village outskirts, a collection of wooden huts that had once stored grain. The prisoners moved in subdued lines, the shuffle of their boots mixing with birdsong and the distant clink of tools from fields already being cleared for planting. No one spoke loudly. The war had taught all of them the weight of noise. Instead, there were only exchanged glances, some wary, some curious, some softened by exhaustion. For the villagers, seeing these men alive and vulnerable stirred complicated feelings. Fear lingered, but so did a faint, unexpected sympathy. These were no longer faceless enemies. They were weary human beings, carrying their own losses. Their arrival marked the beginning of a delicate, uneasy coexistence, a question quietly forming in the minds of all who watched. What happens when the boundaries of war dissolve, but the people remain? The French officers carried themselves with the steady composure expected of men in uniform, yet beneath that calm exterior lived a quiet turmoil. They had survived a war that asked impossible things of them, and now peace demanded something just as complex: restraint, fairness, and a measure of compassion toward those who had once been armed against them. Each day they walked the perimeter of the camp, listening to the soft murmur of prisoners at work, feeling the weight of responsibility press against the lighter pull of their own humanity. They were soldiers, trained to follow orders, but they were also men who had seen enough suffering to recognize it in the eyes of captured Germans who no longer. So they weighed risks against needs, orders against conscience, imagining a path where duty did not suffocate humanity. And in those private moments, the idea of allowing the prisoners into the fields began to feel less like a gamble and more like a cautious, necessary mercy. The village that lay beyond the camp's edge carried the look of a place stretched thin by too many hard seasons. Its stone houses, once bright with painted shutters and flower boxes, now bore chipped edges and muted colors, as if time and grief had worn them down together. Smoke drifted gently from a handful of chimneys, signs of families doing their best with what little they had. The square, where markets had once bustled, now opened each morning with only a few stalls, sparse baskets of potatoes, a bundle of wilted greens, a jar or two of honey saved from healthier years. People moved carefully, their voices low, their gestures slow, as though noise itself had become too costly. When the German prisoners first appeared on the outskirts of the villagers reacted with a quiet, guarded unease. Some kept their distance entirely, watching from behind curtained windows. Others, worn by loss, simply nodded and went on with their chores, too tired to hold tightly to old rage. These were families who had buried sons, brothers, neighbors. Their grief did not vanish, but it had softened into a kind of weary acceptance, one that found little energy for hatred. They saw the prisoners' thin frames, their cautious steps, and recognized the look of men who had also lost more than they dared express. Over time, the tension in the streets loosened slightly, not out of forgiveness, but out of shared exhaustion. The decision came on an afternoon washed in soft, uneven light, the kind that made the landscape look gentler than the truth beneath it. The officers gathered at a long wooden table inside the small command post, its surface crowded with maps, reports, and a few chipped mugs of cooling coffee. Outside, the murmur of prisoners drifting through their routines carried faintly through the window, a reminder of the responsibility that pressed on every man in the room. The officers spoke quietly, weighing risks with the steady tone of people who had learned not to rush any choice touched by war. Yet even in their careful deliberation, a different feeling threaded through the conversation, an urge to acknowledge that the world beyond the camp needed hands, and that these captured men, warned but willing, might offer help where help was scarce. They reviewed each point as if turning over stones: security concerns, local fears, the need for supervision. But they also spoke of the orphans, of untended fields, of gardens that could feed children if only someone would coax life from the soil again. In the end, the arguments for compassion carried a quiet weight the others could not match. The officers knew it was not a simple act. It was a step into uncertain trust, a choice that required them to see their former enemies not as threats, but as human beings caught in the same aftermath. When they finally agreed to open the gates, to let the prisoners step into the fields and work the earth, the decision felt both fragile and
seeds that had survived the winter months. The prisoners paused before them, unsure whether to reach out or wait for instruction, their hesitation creating a quiet tension that neither side quite knew how to break. When the first man finally knelt, pressing his hand into the cool, forgiving soil, something shifted. Others followed slowly, touching the earth as though reacquainting themselves with a language they had once known. The guards watched, alert, but softened by the simple, unthreatening motions of men turning soil rather than wielding weapons. Birds circled overhead, filling the silence with small calls that made the moment feel unexpectedly gentle. Still, unease lingered in the air. Every movement felt like a question, every shared glance a test. Yet as dirt began to loosen beneath their hands and small furrows formed, the awkwardness eased just slightly. It was the kind of beginning that made no promises, but held the faint outline of cooperation, like a seed buried with cautious hope that it might one day rise toward the light. The children noticed the change before anyone told them. From the windows of the old schoolhouse that now served as their shelter, they saw figures moving in the fields, men in worn uniforms, bending and rising in slow rhythms that looked nothing like the sharp, hurried gestures of soldiers they remembered. At first, the orphans watched with a mix of curiosity and caution, their small faces framed by cracked panes of glass. They pressed fingertips to the cool surface, leaning forward just enough to see, but not enough to be seen. The presence of these prisoners stirred emotions they couldn't quite name.
And though they kept their distance, the children's presence lingered like a gentle question, waiting patiently for an answer only time could offer. As the days unfolded, a quiet rhythm settled over the fields, softening the edges of suspicion that had once separated everyone who stood upon that soil. The prisoners worked in steady lines, their hands moving with a kind of instinctive memory, shaping furrows and patting down mounds of earth with gentle precision. Some hummed under their breath, low tunes carried from distant homes, while others simply focused on the simple comfort of the task. The French guards, once tense and vigilant, found their posture easing as they watched men perform gestures older than any uniform, digging, planting, pausing to study the sky for signs of weather. The earth made no distinctions between them. It received their efforts with the same quiet acceptance. There was something healing in those shared movements, something that reached deeper than any order or command. Kneeling at the edge of a row, one prisoner lifted a handful of soil and let it slip slowly through his fingers, watching as the grains caught the sunlight before falling back into place. The gesture was small, almost unconscious, yet it seemed to acknowledge a truth none of them could put into words. The war had taken so much, but here, in this patch of land, they were contributing to something that might grow. The villagers saw this too.
It began with the smallest gestures, almost shy in their simplicity. A prisoner lifting a watering can he wasn't strong enough to carry alone. A French guard stepping forward, offering a hand without speaking. The two men lifted the weight together, their movements awkward but sincere. And when the task was done, they exchanged a brief nod, nothing more. But it lingered in the air like the first crack of warmth after a long winter. Sooner, other moments followed. A tool passed from one set of callous fingers to another. A quiet merci, answered by a hesitant bitter. Both words soft, as if testing whether language could feel safe again. These small exchanges stitched the days together. The guards began to notice which prisoners were skilled with pruning shears, or which understood how to coax reluctant sprouts from stubborn ground. The prisoners, in turn, learned the rhythms of the French men who watched over them, the guard who hummed through his patrols, the one who whittled wood during breaks, the one whose stern face softened whenever a child wandered near the field's edge. Sometimes these observations led to tiny conversations, quick and low, like stepping stones placed gently across a river neither side had yet dared to cross. Nothing dramatic changed. Suspicion didn't vanish. Old wounds didn't magically close. But a quiet recognition began to settle between them. an understanding built not on shared histories, but on shared moments of work and tired smiles. And as these simple gestures accumulated, the distance between the two groups shrank in ways no one had.
Soon, the children were kneeling beside him, their small hands clumsy but eager. Other prisoners noticed and joined in, sharing simple tips through gestures, tracing little lines in the dirt to show spacing, guiding tiny fingers without touching, leaving room for choice and comfort. The guards watched carefully at first, but the sight before them felt more soothing than dangerous. Men teaching children how to coax life from the earth. For the orphans, these lessons offered something rare: attention, shared purpose, and the gentle approval of grown men who carried no authority over them. And for the prisoners, guiding these fragile lives created a warmth they hadn't expected, as if tending young plants and tending young hearts were not so different after all. From the edge of the fields, the officers often stood with their hands clasped behind their backs, saying little as they watched the unlikely scenes unfolding before them. They had expected cooperation, perhaps even a reluctant routine, but not this. Children kneeling beside prisoners, guards sharing small conversations with the men they once regarded only with suspicion. The officers kept a calm, measured expression, yet inside something gentle stirred. They saw how the prisoner's shoulders relaxed when a child laughed, how the guard's sternness softened when they noticed seedlings rising straight and healthy under careful hands. These were moments no order could manufacture, moments born from the quiet spaces left behind when fear slowly loosened its grip. Some officers remembered their own younger years, gardens tended with fathers or brothers now gone, the familiar comfort of soil and sun. Watching these scenes return in a different form felt like witnessing a small fragment of normal life stitching itself back together. They exchanged glances, subtle nods that acknowledged something working beyond their calculations. The risks they had debated, security, loyalty, uncertainty, still existed, but they seemed lighter now, as if balanced by the simple truth unfolding each day, that given a chance, people often lean toward decency more naturally than resentment.
As the officers stepped away from the fields each evening, they carried with them a quiet sense of reassurance. Their decision, once fragile and uncertain, had begun to blossom into something meaningful. And though they knew the future remained unpredictable, they could see, in the gentle hush of the gardens, that moral courage sometimes yielded its own quiet rewards. By late summer, the gardens had shifted from hopeful experiment to living proof that patience could mend more than soil. Rows of vegetables stood tall and generous, their leaves catching the warm light in soft, steady breaths. The prisoners moved through them with a quiet pride, harvesting each head of cabbage or bundle of beans with the same care they had used to plant them. French guards walked beside them, not as overseers, but almost as partners in a shared accomplishment. Their conversations came easily now, simple remarks about weather or ripeness, gentle humor exchanged without hesitation. Every basket filled seemed to confirm what months of careful labor had already suggested. Something good had rooted here, something steadier than fear. The orphans joined in too, darting between rows with small woven baskets, laughing when tomatoes slipped from their hands or when a prisoner pretended not to see them sneak an extra berry. Their joy carried through the fields, brightening the long afternoons and reminding everyone that this harvest was more than food. It was a season of healing, a quiet triumph over the shadows left by war. Villagers watched from a distance, their faces soft with gratitude, understanding that these moments were gifts the world rarely offered so soon after conflict. As the sun dipped behind the hills and the final baskets were gathered, the fields held a peaceful fullness. It felt as though the land itself acknowledged the shared effort, whispering a reminder that growth.
At first, the conversations were hesitant. Small comments about the taste of the stew or a memory sparked by the smell of roasted carrots. But as the meals stretched on, stories began to surface. A French villager spoke of his vineyard, now tended by his daughter. A German prisoner mentioned the apple tree that grew behind his childhood home. An orphan described a dream of keeping bees, her voice trembling until a prisoner nodded encouragingly, as if promising that such dreams were worth holding. These exchanges were gentle, unhurried, carried by the soft clink of spoons and the low hum of summer insects. No one tried to solve the past or explain it. Instead, they simply listened, really listened, allowing each story to settle in the space between them. With every shared memory, the invisible walls built by fear and loss thinned a little more. The meals became a quiet tapestry of human connection, woven from vulnerability and the simple comfort of being heard. And when the lanterns finally dimmed, their fading light left behind the warm understanding that healing often begins with something as ordinary and extraordinary as sharing a table. Yet, even as the village settled into its gentle rhythm of shared meals and growing trust, the world beyond the garden walls continued to shift in ways no one could ignore. Letters arrived from distant regions describing shortages, border tensions, and political reshuffling that reminded everyone that peace was still fragile, still learning how to stand on its unsteady legs. Newspapers, passed quietly from hand to hand, carried headlines that made brows tighten and shoulders sink. The prisoners read them with a mixture of longing and dread, tracing unfamiliar words with fingers that had grown accustomed to soil. Sometimes the sound of boots on the main road or the distant rumble of a transport truck would ripple through the village and bring back an old tension. The children noticed it first, falling silent as they listened for clues in the shifting air. The guards felt it too, their gazes flicking toward the horizon as if expecting a shadow from the past to reappear. Even the prisoners sensed the change in the wind, the way it carried faint hints of news and orders moving steadily toward them. The garden, once a world of its own, now felt slightly removed from time, as if suspended between the life they had built together and the uncertain tide waiting beyond the fields. And though no one said it aloud, a quiet understanding grew among them that this fragile season could not last forever. The ripening of the land had always been a gift borrowed from an unpredictable world, and soon that world would come calling, asking each of them to return to the paths they had left behind. The news arrived on a cool morning, carried by an officer whose expression revealed the truth before he ever spoke. The prisoners saw it in the way he approached, slow steps, eyes lowered, not with authority, but with the heaviness of someone tasked with breaking a gentle rhythm. When he finally read the orders, the words seemed to drift over the fields like an unexpected chill. The prisoners were to be transported soon, returned to processing camps far from the village. No explanation was offered, only a date and a list of procedures. The war had ended, but its machinery still moved. Everyone understood that this was the natural order of things, yet it felt like losing a piece of rare peace they had only just begun to trust. And beneath that understanding lived a quiet gratitude for what the season had given them, something meaningful, however brief, that would not disappear simply because the men who helped create it were leaving. The morning after the prisoners departed, the garden felt unusually still, as though it were holding the breath they had left behind. The orphans wandered into the fields in small, quiet groups, unsure whether they were allowed to feel the heaviness settling over them. The rows of vegetables stood untouched, shimmering faintly with dew, waiting for familiar footsteps that would not return.
The children moved along the paths the prisoners had shaped, tracing the lines in the soil with their toes, touching the wooden stakes the men had hammered into place. Every corner of the garden felt like a memory, soft, warm, and slightly out of reach. Some of the younger children knelt where they once had worked beside patient hands and steady voices. They scooped up earth the way they had been taught, letting it crumble slowly between their small fingers. Others brought watering cans, filling them carefully at the old pump before walking the rows with the same deliberate steps they had copied from the men. There were no lessons to guide them now, but they remembered enough. They remembered spacing, softness, the gentle push of thumb to soil. They remembered the smiles, small and cautious at first, that had grown warmer with each passing week. Caretakers watched from a distance, recognizing the tender devotion blooming beneath the children's quiet movements. The garden had become more than a place to grow food. It was a living reminder of unexpected kindness, of hands that had offered guidance instead of harm. And as the children tended each row with a seriousness far beyond their years, the garden seemed to welcome them, carrying forward the gentle echoes of those who had once shared its care.
In the days after the prisoners departed, the commanders walked the edges of the quiet fields with a slower, more thoughtful stride. They no longer searched for danger. Instead, they observed the careful order the men had left behind. The rows were even, the tools neatly arranged, the soil still showing the imprint of hands that had worked it with patience. These small signs reminded the officers of the risks they had debated and the uncertainty that had shaped their early decisions. They understood, with a clarity that came only in hindsight, that compassion had never weakened their duty. It had refined it, showing them that leadership in a wounded world required more than caution. It required allowing room for decency to surface even in unlikely places. The prisoners had entered the village as former enemies, but they had worked as men trying to repair something, perhaps in the land, perhaps in themselves. As the commanders turned back toward the village, they carried a quiet conviction. They had witnessed what care could build when allowed to grow. It was a reminder that even fragile choices can leave enduring traces on wounded ground. And though the season had ended, its lessons remained, quietly settling gently into their sense of what it meant to guide others through the long, steady work of healing.